Did you know that British bikers in the 60s and 70s didn't just ride for speed, but built an entire culture around it? From leather-clad rockers tearing down highways to church-run clubs that welcomed outlaws, this era was full of surprises. From hidden legends to forgotten clashes to global legacies, this is 15 things you didn't know about British motorcycle culture in the 60s and 70s. What began as a rebellious pastime outside a few greasy spoon cafes in London eventually became a style recognised around the world. The stripped-down frames, low bars and single seats of the cafe racer were never meant to be glamorous, but the image travelled far beyond Britain's borders. Riders in Europe, America and later Asia began imitating the look, giving birth to an international subculture. By the late 1970s, as the British bike industry was faltering, the style itself had already taken on a life of its own. Exported Triumphs, BSAs and Nortons became prized machines abroad, and foreign manufacturers started producing bikes that borrowed from the British aesthetic. The movement shifted from backstreet mechanics to magazines and custom shows, ensuring its survival. Today, modern revivals prove how enduring the cafe racer identity really is. Rebuilt classics sit alongside new machines designed in homage to the era, while gatherings at places like the Ace Cafe show that the spirit never truly left. It is easy to picture the 1960s biker world as one dominated entirely by young men, yet women were never absent. From girlfriends riding pillion to independent riders owning their own machines, women played a quiet but important role. Their presence at cafes, clubs and seaside runs added a dimension that popular history often overlooks. One of the most striking figures was Beryl Swain, who in 1962 became the first woman to compete solo in the Isle of Man TT. Although the racing authorities later withdrew her license, her achievement showed that women had both the desire and the ability to be part of the motorcycle world. Beyond racing, countless unnamed women customized bikes, rode in groups and shared in the rocker identity. Their stories rarely made headlines, but within the culture itself, they were visible and active. As restorations and documentaries revisit the rocker era, recognition of female riders grows, highlighting that the culture was never as one-sided as it seemed. Walk into a garage in Britain during the 1960s, and you would often find young riders hunched over their machines, spanners in hand. Most cafe racers were not purchased ready-made, but built piece by piece. Riders stripped off unnecessary weight, tuned engines for speed and scavenged parts wherever they could. This do-it-yourself spirit reflected both necessity and creativity. Few could afford brand new motorcycles, so learning to tinker was the only way to keep a bike running. Some swapped petrol tanks, others experimented with gearing, while many modified seats and handlebars to achieve that lean racing stance. The shed and the side street became workshops of invention. More than anything, the do-it-yourself approach created a sense of pride and belonging. Each machine was unique, a reflection of the hands that built it. That culture of mechanical self-reliance continues today in Britain's custom scene, a direct descendant of those riders who first dared to dismantle factory-built perfection. No subculture exists in silence, and for British bikers of the 60s, the soundtrack was as loud as the engines. Rock and roll blasted from jukeboxes in roadside cafes, while groups like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones gave a rebellious voice to the youth of the day. The atmosphere of leather jackets, coffee cups and music defined the gathering spots. Cinema added another layer to the mythology. Films such as The Wild One inspired dress codes, while British titles like The Leather Boys gave a grittier portrayal of life within the rocker scene. Riders began to see themselves reflected on the big screen, which only reinforced their identity and strengthened their bond with music culture. Magazines also played their part, spreading both style and stories. Together, film, music, and print made motorcycling more than just transport. They helped forge a shared culture that stretched from Brighton's beaches to London's cafes, uniting thousands of young riders through sound and vision. Every motorcyclist in Britain during the 60s and 70s knew of the Isle of Man TT. More than a race, it was treated as a rite of passage, a proving ground where bravery and skill were measured in miles per hour. The narrow roads, stone walls, and sheer speed gave the TT an aura that bordered on mythical. For many riders, following the race was as important as following football. Heroes were made on the island, and their victories filtered back to the mainland through magazines, newsreels, and word of mouth. Cafe racers who boasted of speed were often inspired by the daring feats they saw at the TT. The event shaped the dreams and ambitions of an entire generation of bikers. Even those who never set foot on the island carried its legend with them. It represented danger, freedom, and the ultimate test of rider and machine, leaving a mark that still colours British motorcycling heritage today. By the early 1970s, Britain's motorcycle industry was in deep trouble. Once proud names like BSA, Norton and Triumph had ruled the roads, but they were now struggling to keep up. The causes were many, and none of them could be ignored. Factories were plagued by labour strikes and poor management decisions, which slowed production and weakened innovation. Meanwhile, Japanese brands such as Honda and Yamaha were releasing bikes that were faster, more reliable, and often cheaper. Riders who once swore by British machines started turning elsewhere, and exports fell. The decline was a painful chapter in Britain's industrial story. Though some models remained iconic, the industry lost its global dominance almost overnight. Yet out of this fall came nostalgia and pride, fueling a desire to preserve the legacy of British bikes and keep their memory alive through restoration and revival. Post-war Britain saw a new kind of teenager emerge, and motorcycles were at the centre of their freedom. For many working-class youngsters, cars were too expensive, but a motorbike, even second-hand, was just within reach. Owning one meant independence, adventure, and status among peers. Hire purchase schemes and the spread of consumer credit made things easier still. With a few pounds a week, a teenager could buy a BSA or Triumph and begin tinkering with it in the shed. It wasn't just transport, it was a statement that they were part of a different generation, no longer bound by their parents' limitations. This affordability transformed motorcycling into a youth-driven culture. The sound of engines roaring down the high street was as much about identity as it was about travel. Cheap access to bikes planted the seeds for the cafe racer movement and gave rise to the ton-up boys, who would soon dominate Britain's roads. Step into the world of the cafe racer, and you'll find a culture built on customization. Riders weren't content to leave their machines in factory condition. They wanted something leaner, quicker, and capable of reaching the magical 100 miles per hour on a stretch of road. The modifications were often ingenious. Seats were shortened, petrol tanks swapped, and clip-on handlebars lowered the riding position. Weight was stripped away, and engines were tuned for performance rather than comfort. Every decision came down to speed and style, turning everyday motorcycles into racing-inspired street machines. More than mechanical tinkering, these modifications created a distinctive identity. The cafe racer was immediately recognizable, not just in sound but in silhouette. Each bike told a story of its rider's hands and choices, a proud statement that factory limits could always be pushed a little further. Among the many tales of the Isle of Man TT, one stands apart. In 1962, Beryl Swain became the first woman to ride solo in the race, a feat that startled both fans and officials. Her courage on those perilous roads made her a symbol of determination in a sport dominated by men. Her ride was successful, but it did not lead to a wave of female entrants. Instead, the governing body revoked her international license soon after, citing safety concerns. Many saw it as an excuse to keep women out of the sport. For years afterwards, no female competitors were allowed to follow her path. Despite this unfair setback, Beryl Swain's name lived on. She showed that women could compete at the highest level of motorcycling, and her story remains an inspiration. In today's retellings of TT history, her ride is celebrated as a breakthrough moment of defiance and courage. The 1960s was both a golden and a troubled era for British racing. On the track, British machines were still capable of winning trophies, and legendary riders brought prestige to Triumphs and Nortons. The Isle of Man TT and other events kept Britain's racing reputation alive. Behind the glamour, however, cracks were forming. Rivals from Japan were building faster, more reliable race bikes, and British factories struggled to keep pace. Engineering brilliance was still there, but innovation came too slowly, and the gap grew year after year. This contrast defined the period. Britain basked in the glory of past victories, while watching its racing future slip away. The bittersweet mixture of triumph and decline left a lasting impression, a reminder of how close the nation came to holding on to its dominance, but ultimately failing to adapt in time. Few would expect a church hall to become a cornerstone of biker culture, but that is exactly what happened in East London. The 59 Club began in 1959, founded by Reverend John Oates and later guided by Reverend Bill Shergold. What started as a youth project quickly attracted motorcyclists looking for a place to belong. Shergold famously rode to the Ace Cafe in his collar to invite rockers to join. Far from turning them away, the club welcomed riders with open arms, giving them a space for social gatherings, events, and even spiritual support. Membership soared, and soon the 59 Club was one of the largest motorcycle clubs in the world. It proved that motorcycling could be more than rebellion, as it could also be community. By bridging the gap between church and street, the 59 Club gave young riders a sense of legitimacy without stripping away their identity. Its legacy endures as a symbol of inclusivity within biker culture. Seaside towns in the 1960s witnessed a series of confrontations that would define an era. Mods sharp in suits and riding scooters faced off against leather-clad rockers on motorbikes. The most famous of these clashes took place in Brighton, Margate and Clacton, sparking a national uproar. The reality was often less dramatic than the headlines suggested. Scuffles and vandalism did occur, but newspapers painted them as pitched battles, fueling a sense of panic across Britain. Politicians and commentators warned of a youth crisis, while sociologists later described the phenomenon as a classic moral panic. For the riders involved, it was partly rivalry and partly theatre, yet those days cemented the modern rocker identities in the public imagination. Even now, the image of two youth tribes colliding on the beaches remains one of the most enduring symbols of 1960s Britain. When you think of a British rocker, you picture black leather, heavy boots, and slicked back hair. This style wasn't simply about fashion, it was born of necessity. Leather protected riders from cold winds and scrapes, while sturdy boots made long rides manageable, but films and music gave the look its iconic edge. Marlon Brando in The Wild One and British rock and roll acts turned the practical into the stylish. Soon the leather jacket wasn't just a piece of clothing, but instead it was a badge of identity that was worn proudly at cafes and on city streets. The image stuck, and it still defines the rocker spirit today. The uniform of leather-clad rebellion made motorcyclists instantly recognisable, turning them into symbols of danger and freedom. What started as simple protection became one of the most powerful visual legacies of the entire movement. Long before nightclubs defined youth culture, the hum of engines and jukebox music filled transport cafes. Chief among them was the Ace Cafe on London's North Circular, open 24 hours and buzzing with life. For young bikers, it was more than a pit stop. It was a stage for speed, music and camaraderie. Riders gathered to show off their machines, raced to the next roundabout, and returned before a song finished on the jukebox. These challenges gave rise to the Cafe Racer, a machine built for speed over short bursts. The atmosphere was electric, equal parts community and competition. The Ace became legendary, but it was only one of many such cafes across Britain. Together they created a network of biker havens, safe from disapproving eyes and filled with the sound of laughter, engines and rock and roll. They remain central to the memory of the rocker age. At the heart of 1960s motorcycle culture were the Ton-Up Boys, named for their obsession with hitting 100 miles per hour. This goal, known simply as the ton, became the measure of a true rider. Anyone who reached it earned bragging rights and respect among peers. To achieve this speed, bikes were stripped, tuned and modified, giving birth to the Cafe Racer style. The machines looked raw, aggressive and fast even when standing still. Riders leaned low, tore down the tarmac and returned to cafes victorious, proud of the speeds they had coaxed from their beloved bikes. This pursuit of the ton was about far more than numbers on a speedometer. It symbolized rebellion, freedom, and the thrill of living on the edge. The Ton-Up Boys were pioneers, shaping an entire subculture that still influences motorcycling worldwide today. And that brings us to the end of our ride through the hidden side of British motorcycle culture in the 60s and 70s. If any of these stories reminded you of the roar of old engines, late-night cafe stops, or tales your parents might have told, be sure to give the video a like and subscribe for more trips down memory lane. See you next time.